Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of God, Allah, be with you. I have the pleasure in welcoming today all of you. Thank you very much for coming to listen to Dr. Mohammed Seddon and his presentation on the history of Muslim settlement in Manchester. So Dr. Mohammed Seddon is research associate here at the British Muslim Heritage Centre and former commissioning editor at Cube Publishing. He was previously senior lecturer in Islamic and religious studies at the University of Chester. Dr. Seddon has researched extensively on Islam and Muslim communities in Britain and is the author of The Last of the Lascars, Yemeni Muslims in Britain, 1836 to 2012. He's also the co-editor of several publications, including the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Islam and British Muslims' Loyalty and Belonging, and many others. Dr. Seddon will answer many questions that we may have, such as who were the first Muslim settlers in Manchester, where did they settle, why did they choose those places, in what promises to be a fascinating exploration of the life of those pioneer migrants to our city. Over to you, Dr. Seddon.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Morning, everybody. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum. I'm delighted and honoured to be invited to the second MacFest and to be asked to give this presentation, which is really going to be a kind of condensed overview of the history of Muslim settlement in Manchester. Each one of the communities that this presentation features actually could be the substance of a lecture, self-contained on its own. But we'll go through it briefly. What I want to do is I want to touch back on what was said yesterday about the purpose of this particular event. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the inspiration, because we're dealing with communities who have differences as well as similarities, but I want to take a reference for the context of this presentation from the Quran itself. And the Quran says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya ayyuhan nasu, إِنَّ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ وَأُنْثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارِفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. Which, translated, addresses not Muslims, not Jews, not Christians, but the whole of mankind. It says, and this is God speaking to mankind through the Quran, O mankind, without doubt, we have created you from a single male soul and female soul, and we brought you into nations and tribes so that you will get to know each other. The word is ta'arafa, so that you come to know each other. And then it goes on to say that, verily, the best of you, mankind, not the best of you Muslims, not the best of you non-Muslims, the best of you mankind, are those who have the greatest awareness of their Creator, of God. And God is aware of all things. So just to let ourselves be reminded by the Quran that actually, although today we're going to talk about communities, but this community is not isolated, or these communities are not isolated. They are part of the wider society in Manchester and in Britain. So here are two photographs. The top one is a view of Manchester in the mid-18th century. I'm not sure how clear it is, but you can see industrialization starting to take place. You see smoke from the chimneys, the factories, cotton factories, etc. You can see the cathedral there, Manchester Cathedral. Underneath is a strange, exotic-looking photograph, again a bit blurry, but these are Levantine merchants who came to settle in Manchester and recorded in the business directories that date back from that time are 4 Arab trading houses established in Manchester, importing and exporting largely cotton goods in 1798. The probability is that these 4 independent traders may have been Jewish, may have been Christian, but they could easily have been Muslim as well. By 1838, an agreement is signed between the Turkish Sultan and the British government, signed at Baltaliman in Turkey. The Anglo-Turkish Treaty, as it was called, which led to Turkey importing more piece goods from Manchester alone, from these mills in Manchester alone, than the rest of the world. And these merchants that came to settle from the Ottoman Empire, as it was then, were crucial as the nexus for this importing and exporting, and they became very, very wealthy and very influential. So much so that by 1850, there was an Ottoman consul in Manchester. He was a merchant. He's recorded in a number of history books on Manchester and trade directorate. His name was, well, it's written as Abdullah Yadilbi, but it is more likely that he took his last name from the place name of Idlib, which unfortunately is in the news as we speak because of the crisis that's taking place in Syria. But Idlib, of course, is part of modern-day Syria, and it's Arab-speaking people that live in that region. So, although he was a sovereign of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, he was actually, in almost probability, an Arab trader. Then by 1890, 100 years later, almost to the day, we can see the increase. 400 Arab trading houses established in the city. So within 100 years, you can see the increase in that trade and the large presence of largely Muslim settlers to the city. Okay. I want to move on to something that was kind of the subject of my published PhD. Does anybody know what the word Lascar means? Anybody? Sailor. Yes, it does, but it is a corruption. In Urdu, it means sailor and Persian, but it's a corruption of the Arabic word al-askari, which means a soldier. But the Lascars, which is now in the English dictionary, refers to generally Oriental sailors that came as a part of the British Empire. And by 1896, recorded in his work, The East in the West, or Work Amongst the Asiatic and African in London, a reverend of the Church of England, Reverend Salter was his name, Joseph Salter. He recorded the squalor in which these Lascars who lived around the Docklands, not just of London, but of Manchester, of Liverpool, of South Shields, and even reported that some of them were kind of, hidden away in little kind of opium dens, and because their situation was so dire that they had kind of given up and were drug addicts, etc. By 1850, again, we know that on the other side of the economic spectrum, we've got wealthy Arab merchants living and settled in the city. But we've got a lodging house in Salford, nearby, most probably because of the ship canal and its proximity to it. There was an Asiatic lodging house, and Salter tells us that there were about 10 Asiatic, and that includes people from the Far East, from Malaysia and modern-day Indonesia, as well as Indian colonial subjects who had come on the ships and then were waiting to find their way back on a ship. Sometimes it took years and years. So they lived very squalidly in houses like the one you can see there, slightly dark. Sometimes as many as 6 to 10 in a single room. Imagine your own bedroom at home. Imagine 6 to 10 males all crammed in there, trying to sleep, eat, and whatever. Another character who also turns up in London, interestingly enough. So it shows that the Lascars, wherever they left ship, whether it be Manchester, South Shields, Liverpool, or London, were so desperate that they would travel to other parts of the country seeking work and trying to find a better chance of perhaps getting back from whence they came. But this gentleman was known locally as Monkey Abraham, which of course is a very, very telling name given to him. Why? Because he dressed very strangely in his exotic Eastern costume, and he wore silver bracelets and chains around his neck, and he danced and sang to make a living. No shame in that if you're without any source of income. The guy's just trying to put food in his mouth. But the way he did it was, unfortunately, by having to other himself, to make himself an exotic spectacle. So people would laugh, he looks like a monkey, give him a penny. So sad. But it's an example again of how the Lascars, at the other end of the economic scale, in this very city, were struggling. So these two works, the first one that I mentioned and this final one, are really a fantastic reference source for these early Muslim settlers, not just to Manchester, but to the other port cities in the country. And here are two photographs from the turn of the century. Again, please. The top one shows the crew and the cabin crew. The cabin crew there, you'll note, are wearing a kind of tarbouch or fez, if you want to call it, along with a kind of long Arab gown or jalabiya. And they are cabin crew. They're not throwing coal in the engines below deck. They're serving tea and coffee to people travelling from one part of the British Empire to another. So their job is quite a better job than these people at the picture below that. These are indeed Asiatic, most probably from West Bengal. And this photo is from London docks, around just before the turn of the century. And these are what they call donkeymen. These are the people that shoveled coal into the steam engines that powered those ships bringing cotton and goods and exporting finishing goods across the globe, making this country, at one time the fourth wealthiest in the world, out of the blood, sweat and tears of these people. Okay, we'll move on. Again, we're going to the other end of the scale, and this is the Moroccan community of Manchester. And they began to settle in the city around 1830. They were very wealthy cotton traders again, like the Levantines. Most of them came from the city of Fez in Morocco. And they tended to stay together into a tight-knit community. Now, one of their members was a man who became a noted author in Morocco. His name is Abdul Majid bin Jayloun. And Abdul Majid wrote a book. It was published posthumously after he passed away. But the book was written in Arabic, and it was called Fi Atafula, In My Youth. And in it, he tells us about his life in Manchester as a young boy. He talks about going to Blackpool on the train with his parents. He talks about Sunday walks in Whitworth Park, which is actually just where I live. He talks about the big house that his grandfather lived in, Parkfield Street, which is just at the corner of where I live now, but the house no longer remains. And he talks about a Sheikh al-Milad. Anybody know what Sheikh al-Milad might be? This is an Arabic term. The old man of the birthday is a literal translation. But this is Father Christmas. He talks about Father Christmas. He talks about, even though he's a practicing Muslim, he talks about receiving and giving Christmas gifts. He talks about the abuse and the racism that he faced at school because, of course, he was different, he looked different, he had a different religion, etc. But the book is an insight into his life and into the life of this Moroccan trading community who, as you can see from the photograph, they dressed in their traditional dress, and they were known as the people of the red hats because generally they wore fezzes. And they were noted for their honesty and trustworthiness in business. And this is something that Professor Salim al-Hassani alluded to before. It was a principled standpoint that they should be absolutely honest as people who've settled from another country into this country. And they were noted for that. They were known to be trusted. Abdul Majid's grandfather seemed to be the kind of head of the community, a kind of community leader. And in his house, which was at 47 Parkfield Road, Rusholme, no longer there, I'm afraid. They're all pulled down. It's now new housing, etc. His front room was used as a mosque, as a prayer room, where 5 daily prayers were held. And his back garden was used as a butchery to slaughter fresh lambs from Wales so that the community could have meat that it could eat lawfully according to the Islamic rites of preparing meat. And this community, this newspaper cutting, by the way, is from 1936, when the community decides, because of the decline in the cotton trade, cheaper imports, cheaper cotton is made in India, etc. So the business no longer exists for them here in the UK. So they decide en masse to migrate back to Morocco, giving up their British citizenship in the process, many of them. But this newspaper cutting from the Manchester City News, precursor to The Guardian, talks about how this community is a great loss to Manchester, not just because of the wealth and prosper that they brought to the city, but because of their fine character and upstanding citizenry, if you like. And it says in the article that never once was any of the traders the subject of any court proceedings. So that says a lot about their integrity. Okay, another community, and in a way, this community comes out of this Levantine Ottoman connection that we spoke about earlier. The Syrian community of Manchester. Again, they settled slightly later, around 1860, largely because of a massacre that took place in Damascus of minority Christians and Jews, Arab-speaking Jews and Christians, and they were given, could you just hit the button again? They were given refuge, not just in Britain, but they came as well to establish their business. And we can see the roots are from the earlier slide that we referred to. Again, they were established here for a long time. By 1946, they had a Lebanese consular established in Manchester. His name was Fadlu Harani. And at that time, this is just before Syria and Lebanon were created. It was one province, if you like, of the Ottoman Empire at that time. So there wasn't really a kind of distinguishing feature between the Syrians and the Lebanese in terms of their belonging. Now, Fadlu's son, born and bred in Manchester, went on to become a leading scholar in Arab history and civilization at Oxford University. And there's a picture of Albert with his books behind him, who passed away, sadly, a few decades ago. But the Syrians and Lebanese community are largely responsible for establishing the mosque that we know today as the Jamia Mosque, just behind Wilmslow Road. It wasn't a purpose-built mosque then. It was a large Victorian house that a few businessmen put money together so that they could have congregational prayer. And from then on, it was used, and as one community moves out into the more leafier suburbs, another community comes in, and that's what happened. In 1960, the community moved further south into Didsbury, and the colour photograph there shows you what is now Barlowmoor, or the Manchester Islamic Centre on Barlowmoor Road, which was a church and was empty at the time, but was sold at a nominal fee by the church because they knew it was going to be used as a religious building, albeit by Muslims, making it into a mosque. So they recognised that. Above those two photographs is an article. Again, you can't read it. The title is Medina Manchester. It talks about, in this article, the contribution again of these Syrian and Lebanese settlers to the city, and their integrity, their honesty, and what they brought to the city in terms of economic boost, etc. So again, their contribution is a positive one to wider society in Manchester. Right, I'm going to fly through these. There's so much, as I said, each slide would actually validate a presentation on its own. Just to touch on Victorian Islam in Britain, two characters central to Victorian Islam in Manchester. The first is the grey photograph on the top right. This is Robert Rashid Stanley, twice mayor of Staley Bridge. The grey etching on the left of Robert Stanley is a temple that he and his family established in Stalybridge because his family were from a strange sect called the Christian Israelites. They were Christians who followed Mosaic law. So they ate kosher meat, they prayed on the Saturday, etc., and followed the teachings of Moses. Around the turn of the century, Robert Rashid Stanley, I don't know whether you can see there, this is a photograph of him as mayor, but he's wearing, again, a darbush or a fez. And also on his lapel, he has a gold badge that was given to him by the Ottoman Sultan in recognition of not only his becoming a Muslim, but his efforts to foster good British-Ottoman relations, because they were heading to war through World War I at the time. What's interesting about Robert Rashid Stanley is that 4 generations later, his great-great-great-grandson becomes Muslim, but doesn't know anything about the history of his great-great-grandfather until his own father starts to do some research, genealogy research into the history. And then all of this comes out. Robert Rashid was a real character, and he was connected very strongly with the Liverpool community under Abdullah Quilliam. Have people heard of this name? This was, so we're quite familiar with the large Muslim community of largely converts to Islam under Abdullah Quilliam. So there was a big connection there. The next character underneath Robert Rashid Stanley is a man who was known as Headley Churchwarden, who became known later as Al-Hajj Mubarak Churchwarden. He's wearing there a kind of Middle Eastern dress with the headdress and the galabiya. And what's interesting about him is actually he was based in London, but he was given the commission by the Manchester City Council to do all the decoration for the opening of the Manchester Ship Canal. Quite a big occasion for Manchester itself. I mean, opening up Manchester to the world, shipping out all its mass-produced products, etc., and bringing in the raw materials, again, with the Lascars involved in that shipping. And there's part of his decoration leading towards the Ship Canal. And this is when Queen Victoria visited Manchester to open the Ship Canal. The story is that although he was a professional stage manager and stage decorator in London's West End theatres, although he was commissioned by the City Council, they didn't actually pay him the full fee. They kept a retainer for some reason. There is a biography written about Headley Churchwarden, which makes fascinating reading. But there's 2 connections from what we might call Victorian converts, if you want to use that word, to Islam. So just to show you that, it's not just a history of migration and settlement of people from other places through a colonial or some kind of entrepreneurial venture. No, Islam was also homegrown through these people and has been ever since, probably. The South Asian community, I referred to the mosque before. There it is in a kind of snowy photograph there. And that was roughly on the site of where that first house that was bought by the Syrian Lebanese community, largely, that first mosque. South Asians, largely Punjabis, we might argue that it's probably Mirpuris now, but originally Punjabis from the Punjab region of India. There was no Pakistan in the 1930s, of course. So a few individual traders made their way to Manchester. And around 1937, the first Indian restaurant was established by one of these traders settling in Manchester. So, you know, Wilmslow Road goes back quite far, over 100 years in that sense. The community numbers, even by the post-war period, 1948, even up to the mid-50s, numbered only in a few hundred, if a few thousand, by the mid-50s. And they were largely kind of transient migrant workers who would come to the UK as colonial subjects, work in a factory here for maybe a year or 6 months or whatever, collect and save their money, take it back home, and maybe come back again after a year or so. And that kind of pattern, which also facilitated what's called chain migration, so that people from their family or from their village or from their tribe would get jobs through that man who first came, you know, to some factory here in Manchester. So they would facilitate that migration process. But it was actually legislation, law, that changed the size of the South Asian community in Manchester. And we're probably familiar with the 1962 Commonwealth Immigration Act, which meant that you could no longer freely travel in and out of the UK if you came from one of the colonies or Commonwealth countries as it was. What you had to do is either get a visa, so you had to reapply to come in, or you had to get a letter of employment directly from the factory or the employers that you were going to work for. If not, you couldn't return. So in the period between the bill being proposed by Conservatives, of course, and it becoming law by 1962, so that 18-month, 2-year period, what happened was that these single male settlers decided to bring their families into the country with them. And now we have third, fourth generation settlers who originate from those early migrant workers. And the community now, the census in 2001 said that the number of Pakistani Muslims, at least in Manchester, was quite significant. And out of the then 136,000 Muslims who registered as Muslim according to the census, they probably represent about 80% of that figure, to be quite frank with you. And again, their contribution to the cities in many ways, not just economic, but it is cultural as well. The Yemeni community of Eccles was the subject of my PhD. Again, they're interesting because they're virtually invisible. And that's what drew me to kind of focus my research on the community. It's that Lascar tradition that brought a few Yemenis to the city, to the docklands originally of the city, an area that was known to be very multicultural. In fact, it was known as Barbary Coast, which is actually quite a negative descriptive term. When you think about it, it conjures up. And Professor Salim was telling us before about how we are kind of socialized, how we're trained to fit certain images with certain ideas about how we think about things, people, places. So Barbary Coast was a place that you wouldn't go to because it was full of exotic, dangerous foreigners. And these Yemenis settled there until one of them, Abdul Hizam, moved his family to Eccles, quite near the docks, but far enough away to be out of that community. And from there again, this chain migration began to happen. People got jobs, not on the ships, but sometimes there, but now in factories like Pilkington's tile factory, which is quite nearby in Swinton. So into the factories, etc. By the 1950s, you see the White House on the block of terraced buildings in the left-hand middle photographs. That, again, was a home of one of the Yemenis who was a kind of community leader. But the front room, again, like the Moroccan community, was turned into not so much a mosque, but it was known as a zawiya. A zawiya is a retreat, a corner, if you like. So it was a place where the 5 daily prayers were offered, but the Yemeni settlers at that time followed a dynamic man called Ali Abdullah Hakimi, who came from Algeria under the guidance of his sheikh to bring these Yemenis who were losing their way and their religion back to Islam. And Hakimi set up Zawiya or Zawaya in every city in which the Yemenis had settled and began his process of Islamization. So the Zawiya there is on Peel Street. Later on, the community, because of intriguing, because of the politics of the Yemen that was impacting on the community, they left the Zawiya and they bought, again, like the Syrians, a disused church that was given to them for a minimal deposit and then an interest-free mortgage by a Christian scientist who no longer used the building. And there have been significant developments to the mosque building there. The top colour photograph is one of the cafes. The cafes are a feature of kind of Muslim migrant settlement to Britain. And they're not exclusive to the Yemeni community, but what's interesting about them is that they operated as de facto community centres. So not only could you get food there, you could use the phone to ring home, you could hear the Arab radio, you could eat food that mum used to make, you could find out where a job might be available or where you could get accommodation, etc. So they were pivotal to the development and the settlement of the community. That cafe is no longer there now. There's no need for those single male cafes now that families came. You can see from some of the dates the development and significant changes that took place in the community. 2005, the Yemeni community at last got some money from central and local government and were able to set up their own community centre with some lottery funding money, etc. And as a result, you can see these young British-born Yemeni lads below enjoying the annual Eccles Day, it's called. And, not only do they have stalls where they present parts of their Yemeni culture and food, etc., but they do a tribal dance, which is quite fantastic as well. So that's the Yemeni community. And finally, you'll be glad to know, I just want to touch on this idea of migration and settlement. And I should say in a wider context that migration of humans is the story of humans. Our father, Adam, he was a migrant. He migrated from the celestial heavens to the world below here. And ever since that time, the sons and daughters of Adam have moved throughout the world, across the world, and it was never really seen as a problem until modern times, where globalization, which tells us we live in a global village through these technologies where we can click a switch and, talk to the Yemen directly, etc. But also at the same time, it's reinforced the idea of lines on the map, pieces of earth that belong exclusively to one group of people and not another. This has never been a fixed idea with Muslims. Why? Because the whole earth belongs to the Creator. So the whole earth is everyone's. And you are free and should be free from divine guidance at least, to go through the earth, to travel, to seek knowledge, to look for your sustenance, for better sustenance. All of these things are encouraged and permitted. Why? Because going back to that first verse that we started with, we were created from a single female and male soul, Adam and Eve. And then we became nations and people, not so we would fight and despise each other, but so we'd recognize each other and live in harmony and exchange something better from each other for something worse. Oh, you do that in your tradition. Oh, you wash yourself when you go to the toilet. Oh, that's a good idea. I think I'll start doing that. Might stop diseases, for example. Right, so the reason I wanted to say that is simply because this idea of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, whatever name we want to call it in terms of the politics of each of these communities, is never going to stop. Migration is going to occur, not just to Europe or to Britain, but to across the world. It's going to happen, and it's not going to stop. But in terms of Manchester, in the 70s and 80s, we saw Iranians, Syrians, Libyans, Iraqis, again, largely coming as political refugees, trying to get away from the tyrannical leaders across the Muslim spaces, particularly in the Middle East, as it were. In the 1990s, we saw a series of wars, the civil war in former Yugoslavia, where the Bosnians, who are Muslims, were slaughtered by the Serbians. Mass atrocities, concentration camps, nothing to the horror that was witnessed since the time of the Nazis and what they did to the Jewish community in the concentration camps. Very similar pictures. So Bosnians came in numbers to Manchester. Some of them have stayed. Most of them have gone back because everything is fine. Kurds and Iraqis from the first Gulf War, Somalis, etc., Eritreans, Ethiopians from the civil war on the eastern horn of Africa. Later, an interesting migration of Somalis who came not really as refugees, not as asylum seekers, but as EU citizens. So they came with a passport of the EU, of which we are we still members? Have we left yet? Anyway, who knows? But that allowed them to make a choice. Whether they stay in Holland, where they suffered an increasing degree of what we might call discrimination, particularly through Islamophobia, something that we'll be looking at later this afternoon. So they chose in large numbers to come not just to Manchester, but to Leicester and other cities similar. In Manchester, what they have done is they've transformed the community into which they settled, which is Rusholme and Moss Side, which was a place that before the Somalis came there as Muslims, somebody like myself, a white person, would fear to go in, to be quite frank with you. It was dangerous, it was violent. That was where Gunchester was happening. But when the Somalis began to settle, they cleaned up their area. They didn't want drugs being sold or prostitution or any other kind of crime. So they cleaned up their area. And take a walk round Rusholme and Moss Side today, and you'll have a pleasant look at all the businesses that the Somali settlers have made. They haven't come as scroungers to take our state benefits. They've all opened businesses, all kinds of businesses. So they are people who add something. They bring value, not just to the kind of social welfare of the community, but to the economic situation of that community as well. So it goes on. So there we have it. There's my overview of history of Muslim settlement in Manchester. Thank you for your patience. I don't know if we've got time for questions, but I'll be delighted to take some. Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
a wonderful presentation. Personally, I've not been disappointed. I expected it to be as fascinating and insightful as it has been, especially personally as a French migrant who came here after finishing my studies in France. I came to London to look for work, and then Manchester and eventually Eccles. So for me it was even more interesting to find out about the intricacies of the settlement of the Yemenis in my locality, and it really has demonstrated that these movements of people around the world really bring richness and opening to the places that they settle in. So if there's any questions, gentlemen, please. Yes?
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Seddon. Wonderful as usual. Of course, undisputed fact is that our forefathers, Adam and Eve, were extraterrestrials. They were not from this earth, were they? So they were extraterrestrials. You missed the Kosovan refugees, I think, from your presentation. But also there's another interesting fact that I think genetic research has shown that most of people of Britain, what one might call the indigenous people of Britain, are actually descendants of Syrian farmers who migrated here 10,000 years ago. Do you know anything about that?
Well, thanks for your honest critique and additions. Yeah, by the way, inside of us is every one of us, whether we believe or not, from the Islamic worldview at least. We're all extraterrestrial because the ruh, the soul that Muslims believe exists within the physical body, is not of this universe. It's something that is breathed in to the embryonic stage of who we are when we're in the mother's womb. So not only were Adam and Eve extraterrestrial in that sense, but all of us are in terms of our everlasting soul that pre-existed our physical existence, and we believe will continue to exist after this life is finished, because the soul is eternal. Thank you. So you're getting back to your question, which was about this. Yeah, the Celts and their language. There are different forms of Celtish language. According to social anthropologists, are kind of what they call Euro-Asian. So they're part European and part Middle Eastern. There was no countries, Syria, going back tens of thousands of years, of course, but for sure, social anthropologists would agree with that statement, because the British Isles originally seem not to have been inhabited. So they were discovered, and then in a prehistoric time, and then since then we've seen nothing but migration and settlement.
Thank you. The lady over there, no question.
Thank you. That was a really interesting lecture. Thank you very much. I've got lots of questions, so just two. I mean, the first one is it possible to read your research? Because I would really like to, if you could give a reference where we could see it. But the second thing is that I'm interested in the Jewish history in Manchester, and there's similarities and there's significant differences. But I wondered whether there were any individual families that, I'm talking about the 19th century, made their way into the British establishment. Like, I'm looking at Jewish families like the Sassoons, like Disraeli, that came from Eastern, like Middle Eastern and Indian Jewish families that really made their way into Victorian Britain. And I wondered if that was mirrored by some Muslim families.
Right. Great questions, by the way. With regard to my research, I have published a number of papers, but they're hidden away in academic journals, of course, but can be sourced. But I guess the comprehensive work, which focuses largely on Yemenis in Britain, but covers various cities and does contain extra information about wider communities to some degree, is available through Amazon. It's the last of the Lascars, it's called. Okay, so that's the first part of your inquiry. The second part, in terms of dissipation, let's call it. Let's use that word. Look, before the creation of the State of Israel, it has to be said that what are known as or were known as the Sephardic Jews, that is, Jews that came from the Middle East, shared not only a very similar culture with the settling Lebanese Syrian community, but Fadlu Horani, Albert Horani's father, established an Arabic school because a lot of the children of these traders were not allowed into the prep schools. Various reasons were given, or were full, etc., but it was because of discrimination and racism. They didn't want Jewish or Muslim or Arab kids in their school. So Fadlu Harani, along with the Christian, Jewish, Arab-speaking community there, not only established a school, which Albert himself went to in his early years, but they also established kind of Arabic classes in which a Sephardim rabbi, I actually cannot remember his name, but I have it. I have written a paper that's available online about early 19th century Muslim and Jewish communities in Manchester, and that's available. I think it's available through Manchester libraries as well, and that gives a lot of detail, which I won't go into here, about these connections between the two communities. It was only really the politics, particularly of the increase of Arabism, ultra-nationalist ideas, limiting about who belongs and who doesn't, and the creation of the State of Israel that caused the rifts and the tensions. But the dissipation of this community, the Muslim community has remained visible. For some reason, the Christian community and the Jewish communities have dissipated. That's witnessed by the two Sephardim synagogues, the one which is now the the Jewish Museum in Cheetham Hill, on Cheetham Hill Road, and in South Manchester, it's called the Sadak Synagogue, which was established by those Arab Jewish merchants, and he's just round the corner actually from Didsbury Mosque. So again, you can see the proximity. So sorry, but just generally there.
Thank you very much. One last question, please. Does anyone?
Oh, thank you. I have a sense of being uplifted, and I'm so pleased with myself for having pitched up here and hearing this wonderful talk we've just had, and many other things that are flowing through my mind, where I realize that slowly, I'm in a culture that leaves me feeling quite racist and toxified. And I think we must find ways like this permanently to enable ourselves to recover from much of the very unnecessary and misinformed and stupid ways that we have of perpetuating racism and stereotypical comments that we think are funny. But we're cutting ourselves so short. We need to enrich ourselves, and this kind of thing could be going on in a permanent way. We've got so many resources now and the technology to have permanent access, like a library, but permanent access to the visible and the exciting and the surprising and very, very funny and enjoyable and wonderful, rich culture that we've made and our ancestors have made. And then we go and turn it into stupid toxicity. When are we going to wake up? Let's have fun doing it, though. Thank you.
To our talk today, indeed, we can only second these wonderful hopes and thoughts. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Dr. Seddon.
Thank you.